Step into the squared circle, where the bell echoes through decades, where main events become legends and tag teams tore the house down. From the undercard to the top of the card, this is Portland Wrestling at its finest. One ring, one city, 1,000 stories. This is Ringside in Rose City. And here's your hosts, Frank Culbertson and Mike Rogers.
Hey, thanks, Lisa. Another great introduction. I'm Frank Culbertson, joined as always by Portland wrestling historian
Mike Rogers.
And this is Ringside in Rose City. One ring, one city, and 1,000 stories. And they're all rooted right here in Portland. If you love the history of Portland wrestling, and who doesn't, the characters, the crowds, the chaos, and the cards that pack the Portland Sports Arena, then you're exactly where you need to be. Now, as our listeners know, Mike and I usually don't know exactly what we're going to be talking about. Lisa controls the wheel. The wheel controls the topic. And Mike and I, well, we just try to keep up. So Lisa, if you could, go ahead and give that wheel a big spin. All right, Lisa, the wheel has spoken. Now grab the envelope and bring it over here, and let's see what we've got tonight. Mike, the wheel is sending us back to the Portland Sports Arena, and specifically the Portland wrestling cards from December of 1968. Now, the last time we were in this time period, we talked about the fall of 1968, a country dealing with unrest. There was protests, uncertainty. But every Saturday night in Portland, fans still lined up outside the arena, bought their tickets, and stepped into the world where their problems of the week got replaced by back body drops, headlocks, and the occasional foreign object. In December of 1968, delivered some really interesting cards. Rivalries are heating up, some familiar names are settling in the territory, and the Portland crowd was as lively as ever. So, Mike, take us back to the arena. What was happening in Portland wrestling December 1968?
Well, we've already talked about how the Portland Sports Arena opened in October. So we're 3 months into the Portland Sports Arena now. And to me, it seems like maybe you're always in flux with the wrestlers that you have. Billy White Wolf has come in November. He's here, but he's not long for the territory. We'll get to that. You have the Von Steigers, who are the mainstay heels. And then you kind of have known commodities as far as the baby face. So you've got Luther Lindsay, who's been here for a long, long time, off and on. You've got Billy White Wolf, who we just mentioned, who, again, Don Owen has a history with. He knows he can rely on him. Tony Bourne is still babyface, but not the most highlighted babyface during this month. So it's always interesting, but you're looking at it in this small little window of time with the advantage of knowing what's happened before and what's going to happen afterwards.
And so we're also going to, let's expand our looking a little bit because of so much stuff that's going to be happening in December and again in January. So we're going to look at some Salem cards, some Eugene, Longview, and another house show because there's some interesting things. And it's also interesting as we highlight how newspapers really wrote great headlines or great stories to help promote the cards so that the fans would come in because, as we've mentioned, there was no TV revenue. There was only butts in the seats that were getting the guys paid from Don and Elton at that time because Salem was still under Elton Owen at this, wasn't it?
I believe so, yeah. And it is so interesting because the matches are talked about in newspapers as if they're legitimate sports events. And that lends so much to the promotions when they're coming to a town. And then the colorful writing at the time period also lends itself to people want to be there to see this event.
So we'll start with Salem on December 5th. And you talk about wanting to see this. If you see this headline in the newspaper, it's a double dose of violence at the Salem Armory. Are you going to go see that if you're a wrestling fan? Of course you are.
Double dose of violence just sounds awesome.
And so we won't talk about in depth about all the cards, but on that, you still had Kurt Von Steiger beating Tony Bourne, Carl Von Steiger getting DQ'd against Billy White Wolf. Something interesting, Luther Lindsay used headbutts to beat Australian Jack Bence, and the paper described Jack Bence as a rough one. Is Jack Bence a rough one?
Jack Bence is absolutely a rough one. He's been around forever, and he is rough.
Rough to watch? No, he won't say anything.
An Australian, that's interesting. It's the first time I know he's wrestled in Australia, and he's been a cowboy.
Okay, but there's one note here that I just have to mention, Mike. The
Yep.
paper says Eric Froelich,
Yep.
quote unquote, the wrestling acrobat, won by DQ over Frank Shields. Is that right?
That's right. But my results don't indicate that it is a DQ win. I think he had won outright. He looked good no matter what happened in his match. That's what I'm saying.
And so, as the territory, when it was always Salem, Eugene, and Portland, with other cities thrown in after or before that. But the next night, be Friday in Eugene on the 6th, its headline is Indian declares war. Another great headline that's going to bring the fans out. And again, it's the sort of the same card, but if you're in Eugene, it's kind of what you're going to go and watch, aren't you?
Yeah, absolutely. Billy White Wolf and the Von Steigers, mix in Johnny War Eagle as Billy White Wolf's tag partner. They had a really, really good feud that lasted the 2 months that White Wolf's here. And that's definitely on top and a good main event for Eugene.
And it's interesting, the paper notes that this match would be between Billy White Wolf and Kurt Von Steiger was because White Wolf had been knocked out the previous week and he was looking for revenge. As you mentioned, White Wolf would soon be leaving the territory. He's still winning, but he has been beat up in the past, and so you can eventually start to phase him out. But then we do get to Portland, and that's on the 7th. And what happened on the 7th?
We have the Von Steigers teaming up to win a battle royal, and that just helps, with their push. Pretty rare that heels win battle royals, but then when both of them share the battle royal, that's a little unique.
Yeah. And it was for $500. It was an 11-man battle royal, but I thought that was really unusual to see. We've talked about Snuka and Andre splitting the battle royal, and other faces split the battle royal, but for both Von Steigers to win, that had to upset the crowd, and that is really smart booking. So then we jump to Longview, which was a really interesting card on the 9th, with Tony Bourne listed as the promoter, and it is a quote-unquote fight to the finish, Mike. What do you know happened in that card?
We have Luther Lindsay and Billy White Wolf teaming up. I noticed that on this week, Johnny War Eagle doesn't seem to be here this week. So you have Luther Lindsay and Billy White Wolf teaming up. They beat the Von Steigers. White Wolf and Johnny War Eagle are still the tag champs. So it's just a regular match win over the Von Steigers. Carl Von Steiger beats Billy White Wolf in a singles match. This is interesting. I know it was hard to tell the Von Steigers apart because they're both bald men with mustaches and goatees. Kurt Von Steiger was the one that always seemed to get pushed in Portland. He won the Northwest title on a couple different occasions. And the only reason that I can figure is Kurt must have been a little bit bigger. That's the only reason I have. I don't know if he was a better worker. It's kind of hard to tell when they look so similar if one of them stood out over the other. But that's my imagination that Kurt is just a little bit bigger.
Well, two things happened on this card I want to mention. One is, of course, Sandy Barr wrestles, but it's not just Sandy Barr. It's quote-unquote speedy Sandy Barr wrestling Frank Shields. I'm not sure speedy was what we ever called Sandy Barr.
Well, I bet in 1968 he was speedy.
Okay, I'll give him that. 68, yeah. He's still only in his 50s then. One of the things Jim Cornette talks about a whole bunch of complaints is furniture being involved in the matches. And in Portland, that really rarely happened, did it?
Yeah, when it happened, it really meant something. I was just thinking about this the other day of the excitement that when a wrestler used a chair, it was really the crescendo of the match and really something to see at that time. Now it's a chair shot means absolutely nothing.
Yes. And so in that match, Kurt Von Steiger's on the outside and he grabs a folding chair and he throws it at Luther Lindsay from outside. And that really made Lindsay upset. Why wouldn't it? And he took the chair and he whacked Carl Von Steiger in the head, knocking him out. And so Lindsay and White Wolf were declared the winner because using a folding chair was cause for a disqualification. Do people get disqualified for using furniture today, Mike?
I don't believe so. Not anymore.
No, there are no DQs anymore. And another interesting part was Sandy Barr beat Frank Shields by DQ when Shields pushed referee Denny Peck around and then was punched in the mouth by the referee and disqualified. Now, I really do not know who Denny Peck is, but the paper says he weighed 130 pounds and he punches Frank Shields in the mouth.
I've heard that name, Denny Peck, but I cannot picture who it was. I don't ever recall him reffing on TV. So yeah, I'm unclear of who this is.
130 pounds. That's one of Shag Thomas's legs. And also on that card, Tony Bourne, who was listed as a promoter, announced that he was giving up the promoter's license to return to wrestling after the first of the year. Now, if you look at the cards that we've covered, Tony has still been wrestling, but I'm not sure what he was talking about. But he announced that he might team with Lonnie Main to challenge the Von Steigers. Now, Lonnie's gone, and Lonnie is a heel, but Tony's supposed to be the babyface. Is this where you kind of start to see a heel turn coming?
Well, yeah, it's interesting that they've inserted this into a spot show newspaper, giving you that little glimpse of what might happen in the future. On the spot shows, traditionally, they were not promoted by Don or Elton. They gave other wrestlers a chance to run their own shows. I know Bill Savage had talked about running different towns at times. And I know Tony Bourne ran different shows. And when Dutch Savage became part of the office, I know he ran shows. So they're indicating that Longview is a Tony Bourne town and that he's the promoter, even though he doesn't wrestle on this card, but indicating that he's going to give up the town so he can wrestle. Interesting, just little behind the scenes there in your local paper.
And so then we jump to the 10th of December, and that's a Wednesday night special. It's a great card, and we've mentioned it before. Portland eventually would become a Tuesday night special, but in the early days, could be a Monday special or a Wednesday night special, often a Wednesday night. But there's some great talent on this card, new talent to Portland as far as who had been here recently.
I'd love to go back, remember how they promoted this card, because the main event here is Tony Bourne and Bobby Shane. And Bobby Shane has been in Portland before, and right at this time, he's in Vancouver, really doing well. He did well in Portland, but when he went to Vancouver, he did even better. In Vancouver, he had wins over Abdul the Butcher and John Tolos and Armand Hussein, and he was really getting a very, very top push there. So Tony Bourne and Bobby Shane team up, and they beat John Tolos, who again has been in Vancouver, and Big Tom Andrews, who hadn't been in Portland right during this time period. So it's a match that is just completely cold. There's no issues or anything. And here it is on the main event of a Wednesday night special show. The semi-main event is Don Leo Jonathan beating Dutch Savage, another fantastic match. But again, a cold match. They didn't have any issues. Don Leo Jonathan, the last time he had been in Portland was in a match with Gene Kaninsky, I think in November. So I top two matches that really were interesting. And as I look at this card, I speculate that there may have been another card the same night somewhere else, because not wrestling on this card are the Von Steiger brothers. Not wrestling on this card are Billy White Wolf and Johnny Eagle, and also missing is Frank Shields and Cowboy Kirk. So those are enough wrestlers to have a show, a small spot show somewhere else.
And another one that's not on the card that I noticed is Luther Lindsay is not on the card. So absolutely, this could have been a second show somewhere else. But I want to talk about Bobby Shane because you have a very special memory about Bobby Shane and Haru Sasaki, don't you?
Bobby Shane, he was really clean cut here when he was in Portland. He started his career in 1964 under his real name, Bobby Schoen. His real name was Schoenberger, and changed the name a little bit to Shane. That just sounded a little more sharper and easier to say. He was here earlier in 68, and this time period that we're mentioning right here is right at the time that I was 8 years old. I can remember that far back. That's when I started watching wrestling. And I remember Bobby Shane wrestling Haru Sasaki, and Bobby Shane had a headlock, and Haru wanted to throw him off into the turnbuckle or into the ropes. And Bobby Shane used this really unique maneuver that I had never seen before. And here I remember it 50 years later. He stepped up each turnbuckle while he's holding onto a headlock, and then flipped over, still holding the headlock, and landed on top of Haru and got the pin in that manner. And it's just now it's just like people are scratching their head about why I'm remembering this. But then it was so unique and so eye-catching, and so, yeah, that's a really good memory I have of Bobby Shane.
And Shane was a really good wrestler and was considered a possible NWA world champion, but a plane crash ended his career and his life was cut short in the plane crash in 1975. I do want to mention that he also wrestled here in 1964, and he wrestled this guy named who?
Pampero Firpo.
Pampero Firpo. That reminds me. I've seen a picture of Pampero Firpo on a book. What book is Pampero Firpo featured on?
Well, he's featured on that book called Oh Yeah, The History of Hawaiian Wrestling. What a great book.
Where can you get that book?
You can get that book on Amazon.
Absolutely. Shameless plugs on this show, but it is a great book, 500 and something pages. It's giant, and you should get it. And it's a great story in there, great interview with Pampero Firpo and with the family of Pampero Firpo, which really adds to his legacy in Portland. So let's move on down, and we're going to talk about Salem on the 12th. The promotion kind of trying to keep Tony Bourne relevant. You mentioned on our last show when we were talking about November that Tony Bourne had been here for so long, he was a little bit stale. With what's going to be coming in January and February, there's got to be a way to keep Tony a little bit relevant. And so here in Salem, he is a referee, and he gets attacked in the main event with Billy White Wolf and Johnny War Eagle, who beat Kurt and Carl von Steiger. But it's really interesting. The paper says he's attacked by the von Steigers, and yet he makes a comeback and beats down both of the von Steigers. That kind of ruins Billy White Wolf and Johnny War Eagle, doesn't it? I don't know.
That is interesting when you think about that booking. It's like you're setting White Wolf and Johnny War Eagle aside for the moment. The issues reunite between Tony Bourne and the von Steigers. White Wolf and War Eagle at this time are still the tag champs, so they are able to keep their mojo. But it's just a way to build out those episodes. White Wolf and War Eagle can still have their issues with the von Steigers later on, but you're going to freshen it up, get Tony Bourne back in the mix.
And you mentioned being spotlighted. The paper says Chief Billy White Wolf is on the warpath, but he'll have a partner tonight for what he hopes will be a scalping party at the Grand Theater. We talked about language the papers used, colorful language, on our last show, so that's what it said. Now, interesting, there was a match between Luther Lindsay and Bad Boy Shields. Now, the paper advertised it as Lindsay against Kirk in a quote-unquote special spot. I don't know what that, I've never heard it called a special spot, and that it would be a quote-unquote scientific match. So knowing how much I love scientific match, I'm glad they changed that up.
We all missed out on a fantastic match, no doubt. Cowboy Kirk and Luther Lindsay surely would have been a classic.
So we won't go through the Eugene card, although it's advertised as Indians versus Germans. It's the White Wolf and War Eagle against the von Steigers in a title match once again. But let's go to the 14th in Portland. Once again, it's White Wolf and Eagle against the von Steigers for the Northwest title. What happened in that match?
Well, the White Wolf and Johnny War Eagle win on disqualification. Again, it's a non-finish to keep that feud going, prolonging this program because it's before the end of the month, it's going to come to a conclusion. And if you could get one more chapter out of it, that's what the promoters want.
So we'll skip on the 17th, which was a small card in Lyons, Oregon, a very small town, but it was a fundraiser for the summer baseball fundraiser. And it's Billy White Wolf versus Kurt von Steiger, Luther Lindsay, Carl von Steiger, and Tony Bourne, Luigi Massera, and Sandy Barr versus Frank Shields. So for a small town, that's a really big card. And the reports are from the paper that it was very, very successful. So on the 19th, we're in Salem. And once again, discrimination hits Portland wrestling as women are in free with canned goods. And for it's an American Legion annual charity event was a huge success, but women were allowed in for free. They preferred meat products. Just so you know, you can't bring some soup or some vegetables. They want meat products. So talk about that. It's a great 8-man battle royal.
What an interesting, different aspect and different time. Later on in Portland, kids get in free, but ladies getting in free is just a different time of the world. And the meat products, that's interesting too, because obviously that's more desirable than a can of corn.
But they don't say tuna fish, they meat products. And in 1968, there were some questionable meat products on the shelves of grocery stores. But it's an 8-man battle royal, and I really enjoy how this goes out because battle royals are pretty typical nowadays when you see the finishes. But Portland had some unique finishes, and this was one of them. So everybody has been eliminated except for Billy White Wolf and Carl von Steiger. So Carl von Steiger throws a haymaker at White Wolf, who ducked, and the punch was coming with such force that Carl went over the top rope. And the crowd was, quote unquote, on their feet the entire battle royal. That's a good finish.
That is a good finish. You have Haru Suzuki back. He has not been here this entire month. And, he's always not a fan favorite, but a favorite of the fans, I think. To describe Haru a little bit, I don't think we've ever done that. He's this short gentleman. I bet he's only 5'5", and he has great facials, always making those evil, sneaky facials. And the favorite move that I can remember Haru having is he would get his opponent down on their back, and then he would put his ankle over their throat as he would beg off to the referee. And his body would actually be hiding what he was doing to his opponent from the referee, and the fans would just go berserk when he would do this. And such a glimpse of how wrestling has evolved. I think Haru was probably a master of being sneaky and doing evil deeds like that.
And the wrestler that he was choking with his foot really helped sell the move because he would be kicking his feet and the fans would all see that he was absolutely choking him to death with his foot because the wrestler was selling it so well, even though the referee couldn't see his feet moving. But Haru was an expert at that.
One more thing. Can you imagine if anybody did that to you, put their ankle over your throat? How that would be the most maneuver that you could get out of just so easily, just bringing your hands up and pushing the ankle off. But no, it's just amazing how they just sold it like they were choking to death.
And it's not like it was Man Mountain Mike with a 500-pound leg on him. It's Haru Sasaki, as you mentioned, 5'5", very small, but, Haru was great at that. And also, Shag Thomas is on there. He's in the Battle Royal, and he's starting to wrestle. He goes to a draw with Bruce Kirk. And we're going to see from here on out that we've seen Shag and Sandy both wrestling a little bit here and there, but we're going to start seeing Shag a lot more involved in storylines that'll lead to some January shenanigans that we'll call. So now we're on the 20th in Eugene. Mike, women were in free with clothing or canned goods, again, preferably meat products, but you could bring clothing in this time. That's another fundraiser.
Yeah. Bartering to get into wrestling is a little unique. Very interesting.
And once again, we're in a battle royal. This time it's a 7-man battle royal, and Luther Lindsay wins by he drop kicks Carl von Steiger over the top rope. That had to be a great finish.
Yeah. So we see 3 other matches. The 7th man was Luther Lindsay. He's not in any of the preliminaries. So
he was saving up for the drop kick.
Yeah, he saved his energy.
And clearly, wrestling back then was such a part of the community and the culture in Salem and in Portland and Eugene, because we're seeing we saw it back in Thanksgiving area time, a lot of fundraisers. So we're going to see that again in the 21st in Portland, the Sunshine Division Christmas show, which was an annual tradition. Again, all women are in free with canned goods, and the paper notes that there is no limit on contributions, whatever she can carry in her hands or can afford.
Well, also you look at the time period here, we're the week before Christmas, and for families that might have been a hard time to pay and come have some entertainment. And it's a way that they're getting in free, the ladies are getting in free, bringing in things that will help the community, either food products or clothing. It's really smart promoting, smart, and a way to ingrain yourself in the community. Absolutely. Very smart.
Now, there's a couple people we want to talk about on this card. Luther Lindsay and Dean Ho are a tag team, and they beat the Von Steigers by DQ. Cowboy Kirk goes to a draw with Dandy Sandy, Speedy Sandy Barr. Vic Rosatani beats Tom Andrews in a complete shock to me in that match. Billy White Wolf beats Johnny Heddleman. Haru Sasaki drew with Johnny Eagle. Mike, you know Dean Ho Dean Higuchi, Dean Kalani, very, very well. Talk to me about Dean Ho and how good a wrestler he was, using, of course, the full Nelson as the finisher.
Dean Higuchi was just the nicest man that I've probably ever met. He used three different names during different runs in Portland. Dean Higuchi was his real name, and that was the name that he used originally. He had also used Dean Kalani, which, according to the newspaper, I believe was his mother's maiden name. So he used that name to honor her. And then he's also used the name Dean Ho to play off the Hawaiian entertainer Don Ho. One of my favorite stories is when I met Dean Higuchi, it was at Dean Silverstone's reunion, and I would see him there the 4 or 5 years that I'd been there, and he was always so kind and so friendly to me. He ended up writing me letters, beautiful handwriting, very flourishing cursive writing. At some points, it was hard to read, but such nice penmanship. And he would always tell me different stories. I felt like I could call him friends, but yet he's one wrestler I never asked to interview. Later, people had told me that he was very, very private. So I was a little bit honored that we had formed this friendship. And I didn't want to push it by asking him for an interview. I did at times ask him questions, and he was very, very forthright and honest. My favorite Dean Higuchi moment, especially at the reunions, was he would get ribbed a lot. And I think that was because of his good nature. And one time, a lot of the wrestlers that were already there, and he came in, and Ed Wiskowski shouts, "Good, Mr. Fuji's here." He'd laugh, but he goes, "I am not Mr. Fuji."
And I mentioned that he used the full Nelson. Dean was actually early in the 50s, was a bodybuilder, wasn't he?
He was a bodybuilder. I think I read where he finished 6th in the Mr. America contest. You know, a different look in the late 50s as opposed to what bodybuilders would look later on. He was just a solidly built man and muscular, but nothing crazy about his statue and his physique.
A couple things that I want to talk about on this card as well. Besides Lindsay and Dean Hope getting disqualified, you've got Vic Rosatani beating Tom Andrews. And I don't understand that, because Tom Andrews was, I would think, would be more over. He had been here, he was familiar. But tell me about Vic Rosatani, because a lot of fans won't remember him because he had such a short career here.
He had a very short career here, but he was one of those journeyman wrestlers who wrestled all over, and he wrestled a lot in Alabama. He used different names. He used Vic Mueller and he used Vic Rain. Those were probably his two best known aliases besides Vic Rosantini. Wrestled in Calgary, wrestled in Alabama. Those were probably his two most prominent territories. This is one of his first matches in Portland. So often in Portland, you know, when you debut, you get a win to, I think the promoters kind of use those initial wins to see how well you're going to get over, if they can do anything with you, if they can draw money from you. And this is a nice win for him because Tom Andrews is definitely established as a mid-carder. As Tom Andrews, he's not in the main events, but he's big, and hence the name Big Tom Andrews. A win like this will mean something for Vic Rosantini.
And so Tom Andrews, as I know, but some listeners might not, Tom Andrews would return in a year. And who would Tom Andrews be?
He would end up being the Claw.
Absolutely, the greatest masked wrestler of all time. Sorry, grappler. But it is the Claw. So that's a great card. And now we go back down to the 25th, and it's Portland. The paper says it's a capacity crowd, so I know Don Owen had to be very happy. The paper says it's always tough to keep a good Indian down when they're promoting the match. So talk about what happened, because this was a really important night in Portland wrestling.
It really was. A Christmas night card is what they build for, especially through the whole month. You have Von Steigers regaining the tag titles from Johnny War Eagle and Billy White Wolf. Billy White Wolf, this is his last night in the territory. He's been here not even 2 months. but he is scheduled for a Japan tour in early January. One thing is we really, really examine the wrestlers and where they're wrestling and what happens during this time period. They have so many different options. Billy White Wolf is in Hawaii. He's in Hawaii for the whole year of 68. He comes to Portland just to wrestle for 2 months, and then he knows he's going to take a Japan tour. Stan Stasiak comes back on this night, on Christmas night. Stan Stasiak had been in Calgary, but he had shown up earlier in December in Vancouver for a show in Oregon. He had been the North American champion in Calgary up until December 20th. So 5 nights later, here he is coming back to Portland. It's just interesting as you really examine the comings and goings and their movements to the different territories. And obviously Stasiak had taken a trip to Oregon prior. He probably needed to come set things up for moving here for a period of time. So, and then he needed to go back to Calgary to finish up his bookings.
And he was known as Crusher Stasiak at this time. He was not Stan the Man Stasiak, as he would later become. And he goes to a draw with Dean Ho, who had been on the week before in the main event with Luther Lindsay. So that was a good match for the two of them to get over with the fans. And Luther Lindsay, speaking of him, beat Dutch Savage by DQ in a non-title match. Dutch had said he was going to beat him and get a title match, and he got DQ'd. Dutch is billed as from Minnesota. And wasn't Stan Stasiak billed later in his career as from Buzzard Creek, Oregon?
I believe so, yes.
So I don't know how he didn't know all about Oregon before. He's coming here and learning Buzzard Creek, Oregon. What a great town. I've been through there a number of times. You and I have had lunch there a number of occasions.
Right next to Lions.
It is right next to Lions, Buzzard Creek. And I think we had Buzzard on our sandwich there.
Yeah.
So, but getting the tag titles back onto the Von Steigers is really important for what was going to be going forward, especially if War Eagle and White Wolf weren't going to be as a team, because as we mentioned, White Wolf is injured and it's going to be in Japan for 2 months. So putting the Von Steigers back in the title gives them another reign and puts them up even a little higher on top.
Yeah, and you have just another quick look at Johnny War Eagle. This is his first territory. He obviously did well enough they put the tag titles on him. He really had a great look also. You know, he had a mohawk. He had that kind of chiseled face with that cleft chin. Sometimes when I'm looking at pictures, just to making sure that it's the same person, that cleft in his chin, just like Jesse Ventura, makes it so you can really identify him. This gimmick for him was perfect. And, you know, we talked a little bit about he came, I believe, from the Montreal area, and I believe Mad Dog Vachon had a hand in getting him started and sent him into Portland. And Portland was just the very perfect place for him to get started.
Yeah, and to be put with someone like Billy White Wolf, a real veteran who had been around, that really helps keep him, if he would get lost, you mentioned his first territory, if he would start to get lost, and keeping him in tag teams, this was a way to get him a little more experience, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And the Von Steigers as well. The Von Steigers, they're pretty new to wrestling, but they've been probably wrestling together a year or two. So yeah, they can definitely help him out if he did get lost.
So then we're going to the 26th in Salem, and the paper says, this is the week of peace, because it's Christmas. This is the week of peace, but there will be little of it tonight at the Grand Theater. It's a card that promises all the fury the fans can take. You're going with great expectations because there is going to be so much fury, you're not even going to be able to take it all. Kind of how I feel about doing this podcast with Mike. Your thoughts going into that card?
Yeah, and I believe by the way that, you know, it's billed as an Indian death match, I'm sure that they had planned or hoped for Billy White Wolf to be in this match, but he's injured in Portland. So he's replaced by Tony Bourne in this match. So it's interesting. It is an Indian death match, but Tony Bourne and Johnny War Eagle are teaming up. And this is not a team that has a future. So the Von Steigers are able to go over in this match, even though it's a match that you would think Johnny War Eagle would have the advantage in.
And the newspapers did advertise Billy White Wolf because you couldn't advertise Tony Bourne to give away that White Wolf was going to be injured. So it is an Indian death match, and it was 6 falls. The paper said there's no limit to the falls, and there were 1-minute rest periods between each period. The ending is the Von Steigers bloodied War Eagle's ear so badly he could not continue. Now, that seemed like a really odd finish to me. I would have thought, number one, that blooding the ear is kind of an odd finish, but I would have thought Tony Bourne would have taken the loss because Johnny War Eagle is the expert. And this kind of, I think, damages him a little bit as far as the Indian death matches, although it puts the Von Steigers over as people who can beat an Indian in an Indian death match.
Interesting that the rules of an Indian death match are exactly the same as a Texas death match. And also, you're looking at the ear. This maybe is one of the first time Johnny War Eagle blades himself, or does he? Does one of the other 3 blade him? That's an interesting thing to think about, and to do it in such a manner that he's not going to be able to continue. Probably one of his first matches where blood is present from him. Yeah, that would have been an interesting match to watch.
Blading the ear is got to be painful to me. I can't even imagine. And also on the card, Luther Lindsay beat Crusher Stasiak 2 out of 3 falls. That had to be a great match.
Really head scratcher, though. Stan Stasiak coming back into the area. You're both baby faces. And then to have it as a 2 out of 3 fall match, I'm pretty certain this time period Stasiak is still a baby face, even though he's wrestled other baby faces as he enters the area. I'm still fairly confident that he is a baby face.
And it shows, we've talked about sometimes how the booking in Salem and Eugene was a little bit different than Portland. And this is a prime example of that. And the paper also notes that Oriental Haru Sasaki was DQ'd for using karate against Cowboy Kirk. Why was he DQ'd for using karate, Mike?
Well, we know that judo is okay. Judo is legal. But through the teachings of Frank Bonamo, we know that karate is much more dangerous and it is illegal.
Yes, absolutely. But Oriental Haru Sasaki, again, the terms that the papers used back then were colorful, we shall say.
And we mentioned here how sometimes the booking is just a little bit different in Salem and Eugene as opposed to Portland. And that's so interesting. We know at this time period, Portland doesn't have a booker, and whoever's running the show may just have a little bit different vision of what's going on. So Salem and Eugene, we know, were Elton Owen towns. He may have just a little bit different vision than Don, and he may have been ornery enough just to throw in some wrenches to what Don was doing just to make him angry. And other spot shows that Tony Bourne might have run, or later on Dutch Savage might have run, would have had just a little bit different look. When you don't have a consistent booker, it's like whoever's running the show, whatever matches they really think are going to draw. And so that's interesting to consider.
Mike, you hear that music? That's right. When that music hit, it means it's time for a quick getaway. We're leaving the rain, the torrential rain of the Pacific Northwest behind us, and hopping on a jet across the Pacific because it's time for another episode of Island Interlude. Tonight, we're dropping in on Hawaii, December 1968, to see what's happening in the wrestling rings in Honolulu and Hilo, while all the action was unfolding back here in Portland. So, Mike, Lisa is plating up some Spam Musubi for us and some Kava for her. And if you know what that is, she's going to be out of action for a little while. So let's step into the Island Time Machine and take a look at Hawaii Wrestling, December of 1968. First, Mike, we've mentioned Pampero Firpo, but tell us, where can our listeners find out about Hawaii Wrestling? Is there a book that they can purchase for themselves?
There is. There's a book called, Oh Yeah, The History of Hawaiian Wrestling.
And where is that book available?
You can find that on Amazon.
Yes, and we, as I mentioned, shameless plugs because we appreciate all of your support, and it is a great book, over 500 pages. It's a giant phone book size book, as Jim Cornette said, weighs a ton. All kinds of great information going all the way back to the 1930s, and you will not believe some of the things that they did after when Pearl Harbor happened to keep wrestling going and to build crowds back up, all the way through the Francis family running the promotion, then the Maivia family taking over, and some of the great stuff that the Grappler recently talked about. There are some great stories that we cover in there, so we're going to pick that up. But Mike, there's a couple of cards that month, but which cards stand out? There's got to be at least two cards that stand out to you.
Yeah, I'm looking at the December 4th Honolulu show, and this is interesting to me because they have a ladies battle royal, and which is a very unusual thing because usually you will have 2 or 4 ladies travel around the territories. But here it was probably a Christmas present to all of them to all go to Hawaii and to all compete in this battle royal. So in the battle royal, you have Fabulous Moolah, Princess Little Cloud, Lucille Dupree, Tony Rose, Patty Nelson, Betty Boucher, and the battle royal is won by Donna Christianello.
Yeah, it's a 10-woman battle royal, which is pretty interesting. And also, I would have thought that would be all, but you had Ripper Collins beating Patty Barrett. What do you know about Patty Barrett?
Patty Barrett was kind of a journeyman babyface. He would be in the WWF and emerge as a tag team champion with Dominic DeNucci. He'd been in the Northwest a little bit during this time period, but here he is competing in Hawaii.
Also on that card, Johnny Berend drew Neff Maivia, as both were counted out of the ring for fighting, and Luke Graham drew Jim Haiti. Red Bastien drew Mr. X. Red Bastien had a long career in Portland too, didn't he?
Yeah, Red was here in the 50s and had a really good relationship with Don Owen. I think Red Bastien was one of the people that Don Owen relied upon, his stamp of approval. And Red Bastien really had a hand in bringing Buddy Rose and Roddy Piper into the Northwest.
And Red Bastien is famous for calling people back to back at 5 a.m. Listen to an old episode of Ringside in Rose City if you want to hear that story from Mike Rogers. Mike, I want to mention on this Battle Royal, there was a lady in there named Barb Collins. Now, Ripper Collins was on that card. Mike, was there any relationship between the two?
Yes, they actually were married, Ripper and Barb Collins. She had another name that she wrestled under, an alias as well. But it appears that they were acknowledging that marriage here on this card. I don't think we're breaking any ground here by saying that Ripper Collins was gay. He was married here. Lots of wrestlers that we talked to in interviews have alluded to this fact, but just about every person that we've ever talked to comments about what a good person Ripper Collins was, and that during this time period, that was not a problem with them. They recognized what a good person that he was. Bull Ramus talks about he really admired him because they ended up adopting children. Dean Silverstone talks about Ripper Collins probably being the reason why he started having reunions, because his wife Ruth was so enamored by the charisma of Ripper Collins.
And she asked him if there were other wrestlers, other people in the business like him.
Well, there's nobody like Ripper, but there's some other people who, let's invite them to our house and see what happens.
What could go wrong? Okay, so there's got to be at least there's several great cards, but is there another card that really stands out to you, or two?
Christmas night in Honolulu. Christmas night's got to be big everywhere. And on this night, we have Professor Tanaka winning the North American title from Jim Haiti. And Jim Haiti is kind of an unsung hero in wrestling. People always say he was a very good wrestler, and he is going to pass away in the ring in Hawaii within a year or so from this date. Totally unexpected. He looked to be in good shape. Just one of those very tragic things. He was on top in Hawaii continuously, but here he loses the North American title to Tanaka. Ripper Collins and Luke Graham are the tag champs here, a perennial tag team. And on this night, they beat Pepper Gomez, and the paper lists as Al Negra. And it's a little unclear. I think Pedro Morales was billed to be Pepper Gomez's tag partner in this match, which would have been a fantastic match. And it's a little unclear if he actually was in this match or if there was a substitute.
And then Ray Stevens wrestled Tex McKenzie.
Yeah, this also has to be a very interesting match. Ray Stevens, a great worker. We've kind of teased about Tex McKenzie not being a great worker, but being a great draw.
Yeah.
And this would have been a really interesting match to see.
This whole card is outstanding. And you mentioned Nick Bockwinkel at another time, and he beat Man Mountain Cannon. We're going to talk about him in a minute. And Nick Bockwinkel was awarded the ring belt, which was really the Hawaii Championship belt. But it was, if you know Ring Magazine, that was an impressive thing to have awarded to him. And then he was awarded that because Johnny Boren no-showed. And then Red Bastien beat Buddy Austin, and Mr. Fuji drew Mr. X. Talk about Mr. Fuji in 1968 in Hawaii compared to Mr. Fuji that people remember as the manager in the WWE, WWF.
Yeah, Mr. Fuji is early in his career here. More often in the preliminaries, he made a trip to Portland in around 1966 in his first territory, but he spent a lot of time in Honolulu. He will come back to Portland in the very early 70s, and then he's going to really make a name for himself in WWF and San Francisco. Another match here in one of the preliminaries, Red Bastien and Buddy Austin, that could have main evented anywhere in the country as well. And here that is literally the second match on the card.
So tell us about Buddy Austin, because it's not a name that maybe some of the newer wrestling fans know.
Buddy Austin had a lot of success in Los Angeles, was the America's champion there. One of those wrestlers who traveled to a lot of different territories, but Los Angeles probably was the peak of his career. Used the name Killer Buddy Austin, not in Portland he wouldn't have, but that was one of his nicknames. Yeah, and a very top wrestler.
And you mentioned Los Angeles. When you look at the connections between Los Angeles, San Francisco, Portland, and Hawaii, there's a real nexus where they all kind of just work together. Different men would come and go. Of course, it's easier to get there than from the East Coast, cheaper, especially back in this time where airfare is still really fairly new as far as people flying all the time, where we think about it today, people just get on a plane. But back then it was expensive. And so this was where the West Coast worked with Hawaii quite a bit. I also want to mention that the paper lists one match, and that was Tony Bourne wrestling Mr. Duffy, who was Don Duffy, who had wrestled here in 63 and 64. So him and Tony knew each other. But Mike, you said that Tony actually wrestled in Salem on the 26th. So I'm not sure that he was actually in Hawaii, even though the ad said that he was going to be.
Yeah, Christmas night might have been tough for him to travel. He didn't wrestle in Portland on Christmas night either, so he might have just taken the night off to be with family. But he did wrestle in Salem the next night.
Tony could have done it because Buddy Rose talked about just going over there to catch some sun and come right back, and Buddy had all the money in the world. So the newspaper also mentions that Paul Bosch was going to referee some of the matches. That's really interesting.
That is interesting. Paul Bosch it's all about making connections. Paul Bosch is the promoter in Houston, had been in the Northwest very early in his career, way back in the 40s. It's Honolulu on Christmas night's a great place to see the wrestling talent. If he wants to book any of these wrestlers, I know that Professor Tanaka spent a lot of time in Houston. Pepper Gomez spent a lot of time in Houston. Tex McKenzie, Nick Bockwinkel as well, Red Bastien as well. So it's just a chance for him to come over. If he's going to ref, he's going to make a payday as well and spend time with some of his compadres.
Yeah. Now, I want to focus on one man in particular. And we talked about Nick Bockwinkel beating Man Mountain Canyon. So talk about Man Mountain Canyon, who was also known as Crybaby Canyon.
Crybaby George Cannon. He started in 1953 in Japan. He stayed there 2 years. He came back to Canada in about 1955. Reading about him, he had this unique ability that when he sweated, it looked like he was crying. And so he played that up What a great heat-getting ability to be ridiculed and mocked by the fans that you were crying over the way things were going. He started managing the Kangaroos of Don Kent and Al Costello and really stayed with them for a long, long period of time. Looking him up, I was very surprised. He hosted a variety type show in California for a period of time. And that would have been interesting to see as well.
So let's talk about that show, because on the Stick to Wrestling, they just have been reviewing WWF, and they were talking about the Tuesday Night Titan shows that were on and how bad they actually were. So I got to say, this was maybe where Vince got the idea, because let's talk about some of the things that they did on this show. He started reading aloud from the works of Shakespeare, while members of the studio audience took turns punching him in the stomach. Mike?
That's entertainment. And maybe somebody punched him too hard and he started crying. You just can't make that up.
Booking idea for the next show. Mike is going to be reading from one of the Excitement in the Air, and I'm going to be punching him in the stomach for every interview he covers. That's entertainment. Also, the Sheik, in a rare TV appearance, capping an interview with George by eating a page of George's interview notes, while his manager, Eddie the Brain Critchman, encouraged him to eat George's tie.
That I can only picture that's what a rib that is. If it were me, I'd be panicking now. What am I going to say? That's just a great rib.
And there was one more, and it's the Big Splash competition, which consisted of George and Haystack Calhoun flopping on top of one another in the ring to settle the dispute about who had the most lethal finishing move. Unfortunately, George came out on the losing end after being subjected to 3 big splashes, followed by several smacks across the face with the horseshoe Calhoun had kept as a good luck charm.
Good grief. Forget about the splashes. Getting hit in the face with the horseshoe. That's just an afterthought.
Now, booking, as we like to fantasy book, Mike, we could set up the winner of with Haystacks Calhoun doing a body splash competition with what wrestler that you've interviewed in Excitement in the Air?
Oh, that would have been money. Butts Gerard, the world champion, belly flop champion.
Several time belly flop champion on Wide World of Sports.
Yes, absolutely.
Versus Haystacks Calhoun. Book it right now. And also, we talked about his wrestling as a heel. And he wore a ring jacket to the words that said, "I am right." That's all it said, emblazoned on the back. And the fans went nuts because he was a heel and they didn't want him to be right. So just a simple thing like that on the ring jacket really got some heat. It's amazing how hard people make it to get heat nowadays. But back then, just your ring jacket could infuriate the fans.
Yeah, you hear about managers like Dr. Ken Ramey, who's just sitting in a chair at ringside watching the match that his Chargers are in. And he will talk about reaching down maybe to his shoe. And the people are focused on him and trying to imagine what horrible thing he's about ready to do. And then reading this jacket, just such a simple thing that will provide heat continuously just by people reading it. It is a different time and fascinating at what lengths or how easy it is to get the heat.
All right, Mike, that's a pretty good snapshot of what was happening on the islands in December 1968. You had big names moving through the territory. You had Nick Bockwinkel, Ripper Collins was there, of course, Luke Graham, Fabulous Moolah, all mixing it up in different parts of Hawaii. And by Christmas night, there were titles changing hands. Professor Tanaka winning the North American title, Bockwinkel walking away with the Hawaii Championship ring belt in 1968. And of course, we even had an appearance, as we just mentioned, by Man Mountain Cannon, a man who could get the crowd riled up like nobody else. And sometimes that's all that it takes in wrestling to make a crowd get all excited and explode. That's one of the fun things about looking at wrestling history. While fans here in Portland were watching their favorite rivalries unfold at the arena, a different cast of characters were popping up all across the wrestling world, from California to Canada and all the way to the Hawaii Islands. But as nice as the beaches are, Mike, and they're nice, we probably shouldn't stay in Hawaii too long because we'll never want to go back. because the wheel sent us to December of 1968 in Portland, and there's still plenty happening back at the Portland Sports Arena. So let's leave the palm trees behind, hop back onto the plane to the Pacific Northwest, and back to the Portland Sports Arena, where the rivalries, the headlines, and the crowds in December of the 68 are just heating up. So we're going to talk about Eugene on the 27th and about a new team for this time frame. I'll let you tell us about what they had been in the past. But you mentioned that the stipulations for the Indian death match were the same as the Texas death match. Yeah. Now, so I'm just going to say it's two opponents are going to wrestle Kurt and Carl von Steiger in a Texas death match. Now, the paper said it was a Texas death match, but the advertisements in advance called for it a German death match. So now what was the German death match? Well, the paper said that the von Steiger said rules and conditions for the match will not be revealed until bell time. It's a winner take all, no limit on falls. Now, if you're a team that's going to sign up to tackle on Kurt and Carl von Steigers and they won't tell you the rules, you know that's going to be a Donnybrook.
So it's so interesting here in Salem. We've billed it as an Indian death match, and Eugene the next night, same rules, but they're phrasing it as a German death match. And in the results, I have it written down here as a Texas death match, because that's the format of what we all know as a Texas death match. So it's interesting that they are using different terms in different towns for the same match.
Now, before we talk about the team, I will say that the results in the paper listed as a Texas death match, whereas the promotion ads for it called it a German death match. So maybe it's that very, very rare German Texas death match.
Exactly. And this brings it around. I was just in Texas, and there is a town called Fredericksburg, Texas, that was German settled. It's the only town in the country that did not choose sides in the Civil War. They chose the Native Americans to protect them against the North or the South. It all comes full circle.
It all comes together. Absolutely. It's the precursor of professional wrestling. So, Mike, let's talk about the team that they fought against the Von Steigers, and that's Luther Lindsay and Shag Thomas. It's a new team, as we said, for this time frame, but a team that those two knew each other really well.
Yeah, they had teamed up periodically throughout portions of the 60s. They'd been tag champs before, and here they are teaming up. Shag's going to become a more prominent wrestler. He kind of has to pick up the slack a little bit as Billy White Wolf has left. And so they've moved them into the top tag team.
And it's really interesting because we just talked about that Johnny War Eagle and Tony Bourne lost the Indian death match. And here, the Von Steigers, who, if it is a Texas German death match, the Von Steigers should have the upper hand because they know what the rules and the conditions are. But instead, in 3 falls, Luther Lindsay and Shag Thomas come out on top. That's unusual booking.
Yeah, again, you're putting this team together for the first time in a while. And, you know, if we look into the crystal ball, this is the team that's going to be pushed in the new year. So this is a way, again, to remind fans that they are a polished tag team and that they are going to be in line for the tag titles.
And I will say, Shag Thomas was not in the best shape of a wrestler. He was a very heavy individual. And so when I look and I think that the India death match went 6 falls, this only goes 3 falls, which seems really short. But I imagine Shag was pretty blown up by the start of the 2nd fall.
Yeah, we remember him in the mid-70s when he was really out of shape. This is 7 years prior. He's still probably not in great shape, but probably in a little bit better shape as we remember him at the very end of his career as he was a referee.
So that's in Eugene, and also Johnny War Eagle won by a DQ over Haru Sasaki, and Bruce Kirk defeated Luigi Massera. Now, we've talked a little bit about Luigi Massera in the past, and those people who didn't live during this time period or watch Portland wrestling in the late 60s don't know Luigi Massera, and he lost a lot of matches at this time. But he was really a good wrestler to fill in parts like this and actually had a real hand in training a lot of wrestlers.
Yeah, he had been in the Portland area off and on for years. He started wrestling as Marshall Lewis, and like a tip to the hat of his two favorite wrestlers, Everett Marshall and Strangler Lewis. And then he transferred over to this name of Luigi Massera. He had won the Northwest title, in the late 50s. So he had been in the area off and on for a number of years. And he's reaching the end of his career here in 1968, but still a top solid hand.
And Luigi was one of the trainers for Rocky De La Sera, who we will be having on Ringside in Rose City very soon. So there's your connection right there. It all comes together, as Mike Rogers says. So the last match of the month, 12/28 in Portland, and that's Luther Lindsay beating Carl von Steiger in a Northwest title defense. Now, in the entire month and most of November, there were not a lot of title defenses. And if we look at Portland in October through parts of the first part of 69, there were a lot of tag title matches, but not a lot of title defenses. Portland was more of a tag title town in defenses at that time.
Well, especially when you look, you have the Von Steigers, and so they're inclined to be in tag matches. And this is really smart booking because you have Luther Lindsay defending the title. He hasn't defended it very much. It's been less than a month that he has won the title. So to defend it here against an opponent that he's going to win keeps him on top, keeps him as a good champion. So again, the booking is smart. Even as we look at it in retrospect, there's a reason for this match, even though on paper it doesn't sound like the most compelling main event. There's a reason for it.
Now, remind our listeners, how did Luther Lindsay win the title?
Lonnie Main was the champion, but Lonnie Main was injured in a match with the Von Steigers. And so Lonnie Main's tag partner, Beauregard, defended the title against Luther Lindsay, and that's how Luther Lindsay won the title. Ironically, Beauregard disappeared from the territory at the same time Lonnie was gone as well.
Well, and if you were Beauregard and you knew Lonnie Main was going to come looking for you, you'd have left the territory too. And so they also, again, you see Shag Thomas going to a draw with Stan Stasiak. Again, kind of odd, but with where the Shag is going to be placed in January, going to a draw with Crusher Stasiak really made sense. But again, it's Stasiak going against a face. Unusual booking all month for him.
And, he had been Northwest champion earlier in 1968, and he feuded with Lonnie Main. He had been champion again, a second run in 68, again, winning and losing to Lonnie's, but as late as August. So he definitely had been a babyface and on top throughout 68. Just very strange booking right in this little window of time.
I always enjoy looking at these cards month by month and seeing details. You might remember the main event or you might remember an instance that happened, but when you look up and down the card, seeing how it was put together and what was to come, it really brings back a lot of memories. And Mike, I know when you step back and look at December of 1968, you really see what Portland wrestling looked like in that era. So we've talked about you had the Von Steigers right in the middle of everything. They were battling Billy White Wolf and Johnny War Eagle. They were stirring up crowds from Portland to Salem to Eugene, and eventually walking out Christmas night at the Portland Sports Arena with the Northwest Tag Team titles, which is interesting because the first night of the Portland Sports Arena, they beat Beauregard and Lonnie Main for the tag titles. And here on Christmas night, not exactly sending the fans home happy, they win the tag titles, don't they? That's an unusual way to end Christmas night. Santa was not good to the fans.
And as we look back in this, since the Portland Sports Arena, the Von Steigers are really absolutely carrying the territory on their back. We see the different wrestlers that they feuded with over December: Luther Lindsay, Billy White Wolf, Johnny War Eagle, Tony Bourne. They are in virtually every main event during the entire month. So they really are the ones that are carrying the territory during December.
And you mentioned Luther Lindsay, and he had an incredible run in December, battling the Von Steigers. He defended the Northwest title, and he even won some battle royals with drop kicks and other maneuver, ducking out of the way along the way. And so what really stands out when you read those old newspaper accounts is how the entire territory was trying to work together. We mentioned that the booking might have been a little different. Portland was the hub, but the story was playing out elsewhere. Salem, Eugene, Longview. Each town had its own headlines, its own crowd reactions. As you mentioned, the bookers do what their crowd would react to, and sometimes its own versions of the feud. And you also see something that Don Owen's promotion did very well. We mentioned it, community connection. There were charity shows where women could bring canned goods or clothing to get in. There were events supporting local causes and crowds really showing up. So the territory has started to really pick up from the beginning when we had a capacity crowd of the first Portland Wrestling, but then some lighter crowds. So Don, with the risk that he was taking, had to be pleased with that. And mixed in with all this, wrestlers like Bobby Shane, who only had one match at the Portland Sports Arena that year. Dean Higuchi was there. So there's some interesting talent coming in. But by the time the calendar flips to January of 1969, things are going to change even more. White Wolf is headed to Japan, as we mentioned. Lonnie Main's going to be returning. And there's some new rivalries taking shape. And who was the top face tag team that was rising to the top? In so many ways, December 68 wasn't just the end of the year. It was the bridge to a new chapter in Portland wrestling that I'm sure we'll be covering on a future event. Mike, as always, it's been great history tonight, hasn't it?
Lots of fun to look back at what was happening during the time period and the different talent that came through. We mentioned there Bobby Shane coming through, John Tolos in the same match, different wrestlers. We didn't touch on Johnny Heidelman, who showed up for one or two matches during the month. Johnny Heidelman was one of those journeyman heel wrestlers, was bald at the time, probably a little bit older. He'd been wrestling a long time. Don Leo Jonathan in his Ring Around the Northwest interview, mentions Johnny Heidelman as someone who had unbelievable stamina. So he wouldn't win a lot of matches, but he'd have great stamina. It's just a really interesting window as you saw these different wrestlers come through, even if they were only here for one night.
So, Mike, as we've been talking about, there's a couple of books that we should tell fans they can get that would help them follow along. And one is, of course, the Encyclopedia of Portland Wrestlers that we've talked about many times. It's got almost every wrestler, 99.9% of the wrestlers that had matches at the Portland Sports Arena, small bios on everyone and all the results. So fans should pick that up. It's on Amazon. But is there another book that goes back even farther than the sports arena that wrestling fans should have?
Yeah, there's Katie Bar the Door, which is the history of Portland wrestling, and it touches way back to the very beginning of Portland wrestling. Really comes into focus about 1960. We're really examining what's happened in the Portland area and touches on this time period that we talked about, the highlights of every window in Portland wrestling.
Now, you mentioned the 60s, and we'll be covering a lot of the wrestlers that were in the sports arenas, some that people have videos of, but name a couple of names from the 60s in Portland wrestling that maybe weren't in the Portland sports arena that were really big names.
We've got Nick Bockwinkel, who was here, one of the all-time greats, and he was here in the mid-60s, had a run at as the Northwest champion and Northwest tag champion several times. Pat Patterson was here, had several runs, again, one of the all-time greats. Those two are the first two that come to mind. Earlier in the podcast, we mentioned Pampero Firpo. He was here as well and would go on to become one of the all-time greats in Portland. And that early and mid-60s, every time period in Portland, I think is interesting. But that early to mid-60s had some of those wrestlers that would become the all-time greats, and they're early in their careers, and they're here in Portland.
And a wrestler like Kurt von Poppenheim as well.
Kurt von Poppenheim goes back probably to the late 40s, and he homesteaded in Portland, one of the all-time greats in Portland. Had runs in different parts of the country as well, but really had great success here in the Northwest.
And was an important part of the history of Portland wrestling when we look at him, where he tried to become a promoter and there was only so many promoters allowed. It's a whole nother subject that people could find out by reading it in your book, couldn't they?
Yeah, we touch on Kurt von Poppenheim's efforts to be a promoter, the challenges that he came. To be honest, the biggest challenge was you should have hired a better attorney because it seemed like you or I could have done a better job than his attorney. And that's highlighted in the book and in that chapter. So many interesting stories. And, we've talked a lot about how lady wrestlers were banned in Oregon for a number of years and how that ban ended. The interesting phrasing that came out of Congress on why lady wrestling should be banned. It's just some great, interesting stories that are touched upon in some of the books.
And the name of that book again is?
Katie Bar the Door, The History of Portland Wrestling.
Available on Amazon. You mentioned lady wrestlers, and we'll be having Princess Victoria on talking about her run in Portland, Salem, and Eugene when we talk about different booking strategies. Portland and the women wrestlers completely different than Salem and Eugene. That'll be a great episode. And you mentioned that Don Leo Jonathan, and in an interview,
I mentioned Ring Around the Northwest, which was a bulletin that I did for 30 years. In those bulletins, just about every month, I would have an interview with a different wrestler. And we've taken those interviews, and there's now 3 volumes of a book called Excitement in the Air, The Voices of Northwest Wrestlers. There's 3 different volumes, each one very interesting, and really hearing from the wrestlers. Everyone opens up and is able to talk about the business, tell stories, and I think that they are all very worthwhile and interesting reading.
All available on Amazon as well. And I should let Mike know now because, I like to surprise Mike every once in a while. But Mike, I have put a new envelope on the wheel, and it's going to come up one day. I'm fairly certain as Lisa spins that wheel. And as we've talked about all those books, we've talked about the older wrestlers, the Portland wrestlers, but you have a lot of interviews with guys in all those books that are newer wrestlers, don't you? And we're going to be having an envelope where we're going to be talking about those wrestlers. So you better start preparing now.
Yeah, I was looking at some of the wrestlers who people would, if they're new fans turning on wrestling today, and seeing the shows that are on today, there's some wrestlers that I have interviewed. Kyle O'Reilly, who is very prominent in AEW. Nick Wayne, who's very prominent in AEW. Dr. Luther, who we see on AEW. We have had a lot of, Luther had several interviews, and we've interviewed El Fantasmo, who's very successful in Japan and Europe, and every once in a while shows up on AEW. The Bollywood Boys, who we had a chance to see at our Portland Expo a few weeks ago. And the run that they had in WWE was really, really a tribute to them. And we had a chance to interview them, and as well as, some other wrestlers who maybe didn't make it into one of the top groups, but still have a great story. And yeah, that's going to be a fun show.
And I'll mention one of the people who didn't make it to the upper territories, Matt Farmer, who's become very successful in helping promote Defy, not just in the Seattle and Portland area, but nationwide as they're expanding it, and even internationally. So you have an interview with Matt Farmer. And is there an interview with this guy who was a pretty good wrestler, I understand, thought he was going to go to community college or something?
Yeah, Brian Danielson, Daniel Bryan, very early in his career. Such a good interview. Very early in his career. He's actually to the point where he doesn't know if wrestling's going to pan out for him. At this moment, he's headed back to community college, take some classes. And yeah, we can see that wrestling did end up working out for him.
Yeah, and he married pretty well too, if I recall the Bellas. All those books are great. We mentioned, the history of Hawaii wrestling, available on Amazon. So all those books are available. Be sure to check them out. You can't go wrong with any of them. In fact, you should buy all of them and put them on your bookshelf and read them. So until next time, we want to thank our listeners for joining us. We keep telling stories of the wrestlers, the arenas, and the fans who made Portland Wrestling special. New episodes of Ringside and Rose City drop every Thursday. So to be sure to follow us on Spotify, Apple, and YouTube. And subscribing to those channels really means a lot to us, so thank you. So until next time, I'm Frank Culbertson alongside historian
Mike Rogers.
And this has been Ringside in Rose City. One ring, one city, and 1,000 stories still waiting to be told. And as always, that's wrestling. Wrestling the way it should be.
And that's a wrap from Ringside in Rose City, where one ring, one city, and 1,000 stories never fail to deliver. I'm Lisa Hughes, and this has been a Yaski production. Catch every episode on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your wrestling fix. Until next time, keep your boots laced, your popcorn buttered, and your stories ready.